Somewhere in the Czech Republic, behind museum glass, there is a little clay woman about the length of your hand. She exposes something strange. Humans learned to fire clay thousands of years before they used it to make pots. She is around 29,000 years old. That makes her the oldest piece of fired clay on the entire planet. Older than farming, older than the wheel, older than the first written word by more than 20,000 years. She is not a cup, or a jug, or a cooking pot. The very first thing our species ever shaped out of wet earth and hardened in a fire was not a container at all. It was a sculpture, and some of the archaeologists who have studied her believe she was built, deliberately, to do one thing in that fire: explode. Now, if I asked you when people started making pottery, you would probably reach for a familiar story. Humans settle down. They start farming. They've got grain to store and stews to cook, so they invent pots. And a pot becomes the badge of the settled farming village. That story is clean, it's logical, and for most of the last century, it is exactly what the textbooks said. It is also, as far as we can now tell, almost entirely backwards. The oldest pots on Earth were not made by farmers. They were made by people who owned nothing remotely like a farm. People who were still hunting, still gathering, still following the food across the landscape. And the very oldest fired clay of all wasn't a pot for holding anything. So let's actually walk through when clay first met fire, and watch how strange the real order of events turns out to be. Start in southern China, in a cave called Xianrendong, in Jiangxi province. In 2012, a team led by Xiaohong Wu of Peking University published a paper in the journal Science, with a date that quietly reset the timeline. The pottery fragments buried in the deepest layers of that cave were 20,000 years old. 20,000. To feel how deep that is, that's the floor of the last ice age, the stretch called the last glacial maximum, when the planet was colder and drier than it had been in 100,000 years, and vast ice sheets buried the northern continents. The people making these pots were mobile foragers. Farming would not reach that part of the world for another 10,000 years, and some of the fragments carry scorch marks and soot on the outside, a strong hint of what they were for. Cooking, pottery in other words, shows up in the middle of the harshest climate humans had yet faced, and it shows up in the hands of hunters, not farmers. And Xianrendong is not some lonely fluke. Here's where the pattern gets richer. A few hundred kilometers away, in another Chinese cave called Yuchanyan, in Hunan province, a Sino-American-Israeli team, led by Elisabetta Boaretto, ran a careful radiocarbon study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2009. Their dates for the pottery there landed between roughly 18 and 19,000 years old. Same story, different cave. Ice Age foragers sheltering in a cave, leaving behind fragments of simple round-bottomed vessels. Two sites, hundreds of miles apart, both saying the same impossible-sounding thing, that people were firing clay pots thousands of years before anybody, anywhere, planted a seed. So why then? Why does pottery appear at the coldest, hardest moment among people on the move? The current thinking runs like this. When the climate turns brutal, food gets unpredictable, and every calorie you can wring out of the landscape suddenly matters more. A clay pot is a machine for wringing out calories. And the moment you can boil, you can reach foods that were closed to you before. Acorns and hard nuts, for instance, are dense with fat and starch, but many are so loaded with bitter tannins that they'd make you sick if you ate them raw. And a pot of boiling water leaches those tannins away, turning a near poison into a meal. Shellfish crack open in the heat. Tough plants soften. Marrow melts out of bone into a rich, drinkable broth you can feed to a child or an elder who could not otherwise have chewed it. That pressure, a cold world, a hungry camp, and suddenly a way to cook the previously uncookable, may be exactly the push that turned a lump of riverbank mud into the first cooking pot. Necessity, quite literally, fired the kiln. Now the story jumps across the sea. In Japan, at a site called Odai Yamamoto, archaeologists found pottery roughly 16,000 years old, the opening chapter of what we call the Jomon culture, a society of hunter-fisher-gatherers who would go on making pottery for 10,000 years without ever really bothering to take up farming. And here we get the best evidence yet for what these early pots were actually doing. In 2013, a team led by Oliver Craig of the University of York, publishing in the journal Nature, did something clever. They scraped the charred crust off the inside of Jomon pot fragments and analyzed the fat molecules trapped inside it. The chemistry was unambiguous. These pots had been used to cook aquatic food, fish, shellfish, things pulled from the rivers and the sea. People were boiling seafood in clay pots 15,000 years ago. That is not a granary jar. That's a cooking pot, and it's being used to pull calories out of the water. And that matters far more than it might sound. A clay pot is, functionally, the first way humans could boil water and hold it over a fire without the container itself burning away. Boiling changes everything about food. It breaks down tough plants and unlocks their starch. It renders fat off bone. It kills parasites. It softens food for the very young and the very old, who might otherwise starve. And crucially, it lets you extract nourishment from things you simply cannot eat raw. Some researchers suspect these early pots were also used for fermenting, because a pot is a small, controlled world, and once you can hold a liquid in one place, you can let it sit and sour and transform. The point is that the pot was never a luxury of the comfortable, settled life. It was a survival tool for people crossing a savage climate, a device for squeezing more energy out of a cold and stingy world. But now we have to go backward again, because there is something far older than every one of these pots, and it shatters the pattern completely. Return to that little clay woman behind the glass in the Czech Republic. Her name, in the language of archaeology, comes from the place she was found, Dolní Věstonice, a camp of mammoth hunters in Moravia, first excavated in the 1920s. She was recovered in 1925, in 2 pieces, lying in a layer of ash from an ancient fire, and she is around 29,000 years old, nearly 10,000 years older than the oldest pot in China. She is the oldest fired clay object known anywhere on Earth. But she holds nothing. She stores nothing. She is a figurine, a human form, only about 11 centimeters tall. Fired clay, as far as we can tell, did not begin its life as containers. It began as art. And here is the detail that turns the whole thing genuinely eerie. In 1989, in the journal Science, the ceramics scientist Pamela Vandiver, working with the archaeologist Olga Soffer and their colleagues, published an analysis of thousands of clay fragments from Dolní Věstonice. They found the clay had been fired at a relatively low temperature, somewhere between 500 and 800 degrees Celsius, and they found something strange in the way the pieces had broken. Many of the fractures showed the signature of thermal shock. The clay had cracked and burst apart because it was heated too fast. Now, a careful potter works hard to avoid exactly that. You dry your clay, you warm it slowly, precisely so it does not explode. But Vandiver and Soffer's reading of the evidence was that at Dolní Věstonice, the exploding was not a failure at all. It may have been the entire point. The little clay figures appear to have been made damp and pushed into the hottest part of the fire so that they would hiss, crackle, and burst apart in a small, loud, dramatic instant. The making, the firing, and the shattering, they argued, may have been the whole purpose, not objects to be kept. A performance. I should say plainly that this is an interpretation, not a closed case. Other archaeologists suspect the explosions were simply the mistakes of people still learning how clay behaves in a fire, that we may be reading ritual into what could just be an experience. There is no note left behind to tell us which it was, and there may never be a way to prove intention from a lump of broken clay. And there's a second live debate stacked on top of it, whether pottery was invented once and spread, or invented over and over. The pots of southern China, the Amur River region of the Russian Far East, and Japan are all strikingly different from one another, yet all appear at roughly the same window near the end of the Ice Age, which has led many researchers to argue for independent invention in several places at once. None of that is fully settled, but the physical facts underneath it are not in doubt. The fragments are real, the thermal shock is real, and at Dolní Věstonice, the figurines vastly outnumber anything resembling a container. So here is the reframe. We were taught that pottery is the fingerprint of farming, that first came the settled village, and only then came the pot to serve it. Flip it around. Fired clay arrived first as art, tens of thousands of years before agriculture, made by mammoth hunters who shaped little figures and watched them burst in the flames. And when the practical cooking pot finally did show up, it still wasn't farmers who made it. It was Ice Age foragers, in freezing caves, boiling fish to stay alive. Pottery did not come from settling down. In every case we can actually put a date on, It came from people who were still on the move. And it came from two very human impulses that have nothing to do with agriculture at all. The impulse to make something meaningful and the impulse to cook. Line it all up. 29,000 years ago in Moravia, a clay figure of a woman, fired perhaps in order to shatter. 20,000 years ago in a southern Chinese cave, the first true pots, scorched from cooking in the depths of the Ice Age. 18,000 years ago in Hunan, more of the same. 16,000 years ago in Japan, pots with fish fat still burned into their walls. The real order runs from sculpture to cooking pot to, much later, the farming village we always assumed came first. The badge of civilization, it turns out, is older than civilization by a very long way. And you are surrounded, right now, by the descendants of that first handful of fired clay. The mug you might be holding, the plate you'll eat off tonight, the tiles on your bathroom wall, the porcelain in your sink, the hard ceramic inside a car's spark plugs, the heat shield panels that keep a spacecraft from burning up on the way home. All of it is the same basic miracle those mammoth hunters stumbled onto by firelight. That soft, wet earth, put into a fire, comes back out changed forever, into something hard that will outlast you by thousands of years. The oldest one we've ever found is a small woman of baked clay, made by someone whose name we will never know, who understood, 29,000 years ago, that you could take the ground beneath your feet and turn it into something that lasts. All the research is linked in the description.